The door swings open. She stumbles back. He doesn't move. Not an inch, not a breath. Just stands there in the narrow restroom corridor of Club Noir, like the world built itself around him. Black suit. Sharp jaw. Eyes like the bottom of the Han River. She's holding a tray of empty glasses, heart hammering, and he looks at her, the way powerful men look at things they don't yet understand. Briefly, coldly, without apology. Something shifts behind his eyes, something he doesn't allow. He walks out. She exhales. Neither of them knows that in 30 seconds, the most dangerous man in Seoul just lost something he'll spend the rest of his life trying to get back. Welcome to Lou Stories. Now, buckle up. The night success had stumbled into Kang Min-ho's path began like every other shift at Club Noir. Too loud, too bright, and not nearly enough tips to justify the bruise forming on her arches from 6 hours in heels that were half a size too small. She was 24 years old, built like someone had poured warm honey into an hourglass and let time do the rest. Wide hips, a waist that curved inward dramatically before blooming out again, and a softness to her frame that the fitted uniform she wore did absolutely nothing to hide. Her skin was a deep, rich brown, the kind that caught light from unexpected angles, and her natural hair was pinned back tonight in a low bun with a few stubborn coils escaping near her temples. She was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful, quietly, undeniably, and without particularly trying. None of that mattered at Club Noir. Here, she was staff. She was the girl who refilled water glasses and received half-drunk men's opinions on her accent, her size, and whether or not she'd fit in better somewhere less upscale. The club's regular clientele, Seoul's moneyed elite, tech heirs, entertainment executives, men in suits that cost more than her monthly rent, looked through her the way they looked, through every surface that existed only to serve them. She had learned not to flinch when the manager, Mr. Yu, reminded her in front of the entire staff that her presence at Club Noir was a favor. She had learned not to react when the other servers, Korean women with sharper uniforms and sharper smiles, whispered things she wasn't meant to catch. She had learned to carry herself straight, to keep her expression pleasant, to move through rooms like water, present but unassuming, there but not intrusive. What she had not learned was how to stop needing the job. So she stayed. She carried trays. She smiled at men who didn't smile back. And on this particular Thursday night, when the private section on the upper floor had been booked out entirely for a group she'd been firmly told she was not to approach under any circumstances, she thought nothing of it. Until her tray slipped. It wasn't even a dramatic fall, just a slight misjudgment as she turned from a table. Glasses, shifting left when she shifted right. And suddenly she was moving fast and sideways, arms out for balance, shoulder aimed directly at the door to the staff corridor. She pushed through it just as someone was pulling from the other side. The tray clattered. One glass hit the tile and didn't shatter. It simply rolled, almost politely, toward the wall. Success caught herself with one hand on the doorframe and one hand on the chest of whatever immovable object she'd just collided with. Her palm registered warmth first, then firmness, then the fact that it was a chest, a person, and she pulled her hand back as though burned. "I'm so sorry, She looked up. He was tall in a way that felt architectural, broad shoulders filling the corridor with quiet authority. Korean, mid-30s maybe. A jaw that could have been carved from something expensive, high cheekbones, dark hair pushed back from his face in a way that looked effortless and probably cost a fortune. He wore a black suit with no tie, the top button undone, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had long since stopped being startled by anything. His eyes moved to her face, not to her uniform, not to the fallen glass. Her face. They were dark, those eyes, so dark the iris and pupil seemed to bleed together. And they held the kind of expression that wasn't quite cold, so much as enormously controlled. Like a room where everything was neatly locked away. He said nothing for 3 seconds. 4. 5. "I'm truly sorry," she said again, more steadily this time. She bent to retrieve the glass, came back up, met his gaze with her chin at that instinctive, defiant angle it always found when she felt cornered. "I didn't see the door opening." Something moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Not annoyance, not the contempt she'd half expected. Something else. A flicker, like a light switched on, and immediately off again, in a room someone thought was empty, stepped aside, walked past her without a word. The corridor door swung closed behind him. Success stood alone for a moment, holding the glass, heart inexplicably loud. She told herself it was the near fall that had her pulse elevated. She went back to work. By the end of the night, she'd heard his name 3 times from people who said it, the way people say the names of weather events. Not with fear, exactly, but with a particular kind of respect, reserved for forces that don't negotiate. Kong Min-ho, CEO of Kong Group on paper. Something else entirely in the spaces where Seoul's official world and its shadow world shook hands. He controlled more of this city than the city's government did, or so the whispers went. Half the buildings on the Gangnam skyline had his money in the walls. The other half feared him. Success carried the name home in her pocket like a stone she'd found on the ground. Unusual, worth examining. Ultimately not hers to keep. She forgot about it by morning. He did not forget about her. 3 days later, he was back. She was the first one to notice, which she'd later come to understand was intentional. He'd been seated in the upper booth with a clean line of sight to every corner of the main floor, and the only person he'd positioned himself to watch clearly was her. She didn't realize that at first. She noticed the booth was occupied by men in expensive suits, noticed the energy around it was the specific, charged kind that made other staff move more carefully. And then she noticed, with a low, unsteady feeling she didn't name, that one of the men in that booth had eyes that kept finding her across the room. Dark eyes. A jaw she'd felt the shadow of in a dim corridor 3 nights ago. She looked away, focused on her tables, did her job. By 10 o'clock, she'd looked back at the booth 4 times. Each time he was already watching. On the 5th night, he came to the club in a single week. His head of security, a broad, stone-faced man named Sergeant O, materialized at her elbow while she was refilling a water glass, and said in a low, completely neutral voice, "Mr. Kong would like whatever you personally recommend from the kitchen." Success looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "From the kitchen," Sergeant O repeated, in the tone of a man who had never in his life repeated himself and found the experience unpleasant. "Your recommendation?" She'd sent over the truffle rice cakes and the yuzu dessert with the caramelized edges, items she'd eaten exactly once from a leftover plate and thought about regularly since. A ridiculous choice for a man like him, probably. She'd half expected someone to come back and tell her she'd embarrassed herself. 40 minutes later, Sergeant O returned with a folded card. On it, in clean, sparse handwriting. Different choice. Interesting. No name. No number. Just those 4 words, and a period that somehow communicated more control than a paragraph would have. Success stared at it for longer than she should have. Then she put it in her apron pocket and went back to work with the particular set of her jaw that meant she was thinking about something she'd decided not to think about. The first time someone from his circle made her feel small, she was prepared for it. The way people are prepared for weather they've heard about but not yet experienced. Theoretically. And then, not at all. It was the following Thursday. A woman had arrived at the club, luminous in the way of people who've never had to think about money, Korean and immaculate in something cream-colored and structured, and she'd brushed past Success's tray without a glance and said to her companion, in accented but deliberate English, "They've really let the standard slip here, haven't they?" Her companion, a man Success recognized as one of Min-ho's lieutenants, laughed. Success kept walking. She didn't spill a single drop. But Mr. Yu pulled her aside at the end of the shift with his particular brand of apologetic cruelty. "Miss Success," he said, using her full name in the clipped way that preceded something unpleasant. "The clients in Mr. Kang's section have requested a different server going forward. Nothing personal, of course. Just a better fit. You understand." She understood. She had always understood. She changed out of her uniform in the staff room with steady hands, and a jaw so tight it ached. She picked up her bag. She told herself she would not cry until she was outside, and she nearly made it. She was at the service entrance, coat half on, when she heard the door behind her open. She turned. Kang Min-ho stood in the doorway of the club's back exit, jacket on now, hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable as always, but his eyes, those dark, controlled, bottomless eyes, held something that looked almost like fury. "You're leaving early," he said. It wasn't a question. Success looked at him for one still, complicated moment. "I was asked to." Something locked in his jaw. "By whom?" She shook her head once. It wasn't her story to tell, wasn't her battle, wasn't her world, and turned back toward the street. She didn't hear him move, but she heard, very clearly, him say behind her in a low, absolutely certain voice, "That won't happen again." She walked into the cold Seoul night and didn't look back. Her heart was hammering so loudly she was surprised the whole street couldn't hear it. He was a man of his word in the particular way that powerful men are, not because he valued sentiment, but because he had never in his life said something he didn't intend to see through to its conclusion. Mr. Yu was reassigned to administrative duties by the following Monday. The lieutenant who had laughed was no longer seen at Club Noir. The immaculate woman in cream, who turned out to be the fiancée of a business partner Min-ho tolerated rather than respected, received a message from her own family strongly encouraging her to remember her manners in public spaces. None of this reached Success directly. She heard fragments from other staff members who passed information around the club the way rumors always travel, in pieces, with gaps, colored by whoever held it last. What reached her directly was a single, brief, unannounced visit from Sergeant O, who appeared beside her station at the beginning of her Thursday shift and placed a small, flat box on the counter without explanation. Inside was a pair of shoes, black, structured, the kind of heel that was designed for long hours on a floor. Serious shoes, not decorative ones. Her size exactly. There was no note. "He noticed your shoes," Sergeant O said, in the manner of someone reading from a report. "Last week, the way you were favoring your left side by the end of the shift." Success stared at the box. "I don't need." "He didn't ask if you needed them," Sergeant O said and walked away. She wore them that night because she was practical before she was proud, and because her arches had been grateful for approximately 45 minutes before the rest of her brain caught up and decided to be furious about this, about the presumption of it, the observance, the quiet, invasive certainty of a man who had watched her closely enough to notice which foot she favored and then done something about it without asking. She would give them back, she decided. She would say something direct and clear and composed, and she would return the shoes, and she would establish a boundary that made the entire situation clean again. She was still composing that speech 3 weeks later when he walked into the club on a Wednesday, a night he'd never come before, sat down in his usual booth, and within 10 minutes had signaled Sergeant O, who came to her station with instructions she'd never received before. "Mr. Kang's table, the upper booth, his section. the one she'd been explicitly barred from. She carried the water tray up the stairs with the posture of a woman walking into a room she fully intended to own, set the glass down in front of him with steady hands, and met his eyes across the low table. Sergeant O said, "Your recommendation last time was the yuzu dessert," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice accustomed to being the only sound in the room that mattered. "It was," Success said. "I'm hosting a dinner on Saturday," he said. "I need a server who knows the menu." Something in her chest moved. "There are other staff who—" "I'm asking you." He said it without inflection, but the weight of it pressed down like something heavy placed on a scale. Not staff. You. The silence between them was a third presence at the table. "I'll check my schedule," she said, which was, and they both understood this, the only polite way she had to not simply say yes immediately. 7 o'clock, he said, and picked up his glass, which was a dismissal, and also somehow the opposite of one. The dinner was at his penthouse in Gangnam. This was information she processed with the same energy she'd used for every other unreasonable thing this month, steadily, from a distance, while ignoring the part of her that was doing something embarrassing and involuntary at the thought of being in his home. She arrived at 7 precisely, was met by Sergeant O in the lobby, and was brought upstairs in an elevator that probably cost more than her apartment building. The penthouse was extraordinary in the way of spaces that weren't trying to be. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city's lit skyline, furniture in deep, austere tones that felt intentional without feeling cold. Bookshelves that actually had books in them, read ones, with the spines bent at angles that spoke of real use. There were 6 guests. Business associates, she gathered. Quiet, sharp-suited men and women who communicated in half-sentences and pauses. Minho sat at the head of the table. He'd changed into something slightly less formal than his usual, a dark shirt, no jacket, and it was somehow more unsettling than the suit, more human, harder to categorize. She did her job. She was excellent at it. What she didn't expect was that 3 times during the meal, the conversation faltered at a point that called for someone to make a choice. The right wine, the right dessert timing, the right moment to refill without interrupting. And Minho looked at her. Not a command, a question. As if her instincts were something he'd already decided he trusted. She made the calls. They were the right ones. He said nothing. But the line of his jaw eased slightly each time in a way she was beginning to understand was the equivalent, for him, of an ovation. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap like and drop your thoughts below. Now, back to the story. The evening was winding down. The last guests were saying their slow farewells in the hallway. Success was clearing the last of the table settings when she heard him come back into the room, the quiet weight of his footsteps on the tile shifting something in the air. She didn't turn around. "I'll be done in a few minutes." "There's no rush." He came to stand a few feet away, watching her work with his hands still in his pockets. "You were good tonight." "That's the job," she said. "It wasn't." He paused. "The Bordeaux choice at 9:15. Yang would have taken the meeting you prevented if the mood had shifted. You read the table better than anyone I've had at that table." She turned then, because something about that needed to be faced directly. "Mr. Kang." "Minho," he said. Quiet, almost careful. She held his gaze for a moment. "That feels like a line I shouldn't cross. It's a name," he said, "not a contract." She didn't say it. But she also, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, didn't say goodnight for another 45 minutes, because he poured 2 glasses of something amber and offered her one and asked her a question, not about the menu, not about the club, but about the stack of architectural sketches she'd pulled out of her bag when she was looking for her transit card. And somehow, that became a conversation. And the conversation became the kind of thing that unravels carefully held distances without you noticing until you're already undone. She was studying architecture, had been for 3 years, night classes, around jobs like this one. She had a portfolio on her phone of buildings she'd sketched and reinterpreted, not copies, re-envisionings. What would this facade look like if the weight shifted here? What this space could feel like with different light? She showed him 2. She hadn't meant to show him any. He scrolled through all of them without asking permission, which should have irritated her, and instead felt, strangely, like being seen. "These are good," he said. And when she started to, deflect, "They're just sketches," he looked at her in a way that stopped the sentence. "Don't do that." She blinked. "Do what?" "Reduce yourself." It came out low, almost hard, like he'd seen it happen to her before and was tired of watching it. "It costs you things you don't realize." The city glittered behind him through 40 feet of glass. She was holding a wine glass she hadn't put down in 30 minutes. Something in her chest ached, in a way that was uncomfortable and real and completely inconvenient. "I should go," she said. He didn't argue. He called Sergeant O to arrange her car, but at the door, before Sergeant O arrived. "Saturday night. I have a benefit. At Hotel Schilla. It would be useful to have someone there who knows how to read a room." She looked at him. "As staff?" A pause. The very specific kind of pause that means something is being considered carefully. "As my guest." The word landed differently than she expected. Not romantic exactly. Not professional exactly. Something in between, in the space where his version of things seemed to live, where warmth existed under glass, where want expressed itself as utility, where a man who did not know how to be soft was attempting it in the only language he'd ever trusted. Practical, purposeful, earned. "I'll think about it," she said. She was still thinking about it in the car home, watching Seoul slide past the window, her architectural sketches back in her bag, her chest full of something she hadn't had room for in a very long time. Something that felt, dangerously, like being chosen. She went to the benefit. She wore a deep burgundy dress she'd had for 2 years and never found an occasion for. And when Minho saw her in it, saw her, in the full meaning of that word, the way he always seemed to see her, something moved through his expression so quickly she almost missed it. Almost. He had no way of knowing it was the first time anyone had looked at her like that. Like she was not just enough. Like she was, specifically and precisely, exactly. The evening was elegant and dangerously political in the way of Seoul's wealthy charity events. Everyone performing generosity while conducting business, alliances shifting over canapes and champagne. She stayed at his side for most of it, close enough to be positioned as significant, far enough to maintain the ambiguity both of them were apparently still pretending was necessary. Until a man named Director Lim appeared. Director Lim was the kind of man who introduced himself by touching women's arms without permission and laughing too loudly to cover the fact that he wasn't listening. He found success beside the dessert table, where she'd stepped away to take a breath from the noise of the room, and he was charming in the specific, practiced way that made her tired. Complimentary, persistent, standing 2 inches closer than necessary, while asking questions that were actually just announcements about himself. She handled it the way she handled most unwanted things, with patience and a carefully neutral expression, and the silent prayer that it would end soon. It did not end soon. What ended it was Minho, who materialized at her left side with the swift, absolute silence of someone who had been watching from across the room and had reached the outer boundary of what he was willing to observe. He said nothing to Lim. He simply stood there, and the weight of his presence beside her was so specific and deliberate that Lim blinked, recalculated, and made his excuses with impressive speed. Success turned to look at him. The expression on his face was being controlled, carefully. But beneath the control, in the tightness of his jaw, in the single muscle that was working in his cheek, there was something raw and unmistakable. "He was just talking," she said softly. "I know what he was doing," Minho said. She studied him for a moment. "You were across the room." "Yes." The word was flat, clipped, which was the most he'd ever admitted. Something shifted in her chest. She picked up a Petit Four from the table and held it out to him. A small, ridiculous offering, a detour from the conversation neither of them was ready to finish. "Try this. I think it's the best thing in the room." He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He took it. The attack came 11 days later. She was leaving her night class, the architecture program, 2 blocks from her apartment, when 2 men who were very clearly not students materialized from a parked car and made it clear, with a specific kind of efficiencies that spoke of instructions received and rehearsed, that she needed to come with them. She didn't. She ran. She made it half a block before the second one caught her arm, and she was reaching for her phone, hard in her throat, when a third figure appeared, not one of them, moving against them, and she recognized Sergeant O's broad silhouette half a second before he hit the first man with the calm, methodical energy of someone clocking out on a Tuesday. She was pressed back against a wall. She heard the sounds of a very brief and decisive confrontation. Then silence. Sergeant O turned to her. He was breathing normally. His suit was still buttoned. "Mr. Kang," he said, not as an explanation but as a statement of fact, monitors the routes of people he considers his responsibility. Her knees were trembling. She locked them and didn't show it. "Am I his responsibility?" Sergeant O looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who has been asked a question that has a very obvious answer. "Come," he said simply. The car took her to Minho's building, not the penthouse, a secure floor below it, a room with no windows and very good locks, and Minho himself standing in the middle of it when she walked in, jacket off, phone in his hand, and the kind of expression on his face that she had never seen before, something cracked open just enough to bleed through. He crossed the room in 4 steps. His hands came up, not grabbing, not restraining, just settling at the sides of her face, her jaw between his palms, tilting her face up so he could see her clearly. "Check her." His eyes moved over her face with an intensity that was almost clinical, except for the emotion running like a current just beneath it. "I'm fine," she said, because she was. "I'm fine, Minho." The sound of his name in her mouth did something to him. His hand stilled. The controlled, impenetrable surface of him had a fracture in it tonight, and through it, she could see, clearly, finally, without the architecture of his restraint between them, exactly what she meant to him. "They were sent by Ryu Daewon," he said, low and careful. "Arrival with a message. You were the message." She held his gaze. "Because of me being seen with you. Because of me not being careful enough." His jaw was tight. "That will not happen again. I will not allow—" He stopped. Something crossed his face. He stepped back, hands dropping, and ran one hand through his hair. The only unguarded gesture she'd ever seen from him. The single crack in the composure that was always so absolute. "I can't be casual about you," he said, with the difficulty of someone translating a language they'd never been taught. "I don't know how to do that. I've tried. Every reasonable part of my thinking says I should be able to look at you and simply manage the distance. I cannot." The room was very quiet. "You don't have to manage it," she said. He looked at her. "I've been managing mine since the night in the corridor," she said. "I'm exhausted." Something broke open in him. not dramatically. The way ice gives a sound, a shift, and then suddenly the whole surface is different. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and his arms came around her, and she let herself be held. Finally, her forehead at his collarbone, his hand at the back of her head, and the two of them stood in that quiet room while the city turned outside, and something that had been under enormous pressure for months simply released. She did not leave that building for 3 days. Not because she was held there. She could have left at any moment and he would have let her. But because she didn't want to, and she had decided to stop lying about the things she wanted. He dealt with Ryu Daewon with the quiet, total efficiency of someone settling a debt. No headlines, no visible violence. Just a sequence of very targeted consequences that dismantled Ryu's operation from the outside in and communicated to everyone in Seoul's shadow world who needed to understand it, that the woman under Kang Min-ho's protection was the single most dangerous thing to touch in this city. He told her about it plainly. He did not sugarcoat his world or dress it in better light than it deserved. She had earned, he said, a clear version of who he was. She told him she'd understood who he was since she'd heard his name the first time. She'd chosen anyway. The look he gave her then was one she would keep for the rest of her life. The formal end of Ryu's threat came with the quiet kind of resolution that powerful conflicts often have. Not with fire, but with paper. With the right pressure applied to the right structures. With Ryu's investors discovering simultaneously, and apparently coincidentally, that their other ventures had become considerably less stable. Min-ho gave her a factual briefing on a Tuesday morning over coffee in his kitchen, wearing a plain white shirt and reading glasses she hadn't known he owned, and he was so profoundly, ordinarily human in that moment that something in her chest became permanent. "You're staring," he said, without looking up. "You wear glasses," she said, "only for reading." "You should wear them more," she said. He looked up over the frames. Something gentle came into his eyes, something she saw more and more of now. The softness he kept for her specifically, the warmth under all that glass. "You're going to be impossible." "Probably," she agreed, and smiled at him across his kitchen table, and he looked at her like she was the only solution to a problem he'd spent 35 years not knowing how to name. 3 months later, he came to her architecture school's end-of-term presentation. He sat in the back row in a suit that cost more than the venue, and when she presented her redesign of a derelict community building in Mapo, all natural light, accessible corridors, public green space built into the upper levels, she saw him in her peripheral vision, still and attentive and completely present, and she did not stumble once. Her professor called it the most compelling student submission of the year. Min-ho said nothing to her about it until they were in the car. And then he said, "The section on the rooftop garden, the way you described what it gives people who've never had access to that kind of space." He paused. "That's what you're going to build. Spaces that give people back something they didn't know was taken." She looked at him for a long time. "You're going to fund it," she said. It was going to be my next sentence. She laughed, a real one, the full kind, and he watched her laugh with an expression of quiet, absolute wonder, the way someone looks at a thing they had genuinely believed, for most of their life, they would never have. They were married on a Saturday in late autumn, in a small ceremony that contained fewer than 20 people, and precisely one moment where Kang Min-ho's composure gave way entirely, when she appeared at the end of a short aisle in something simple and white, with her hair loose around her shoulders. And he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since a dim club corridor, since the lift of her chin and the defiant steadiness of her eyes, since the moment something in him had recognized something in her and refused, despite every instruction from every careful part of himself, to let it go. She walked toward him. He didn't move. He simply waited, the way a man waits for the thing he has already decided is his, not with impatience, but with the settled certainty of someone who stopped doubting the outcome a long time ago. When she reached him, he took her hands. And Kang Min-ho, who had never in his adult life permitted himself to be seen, who had built his empire on the foundation of being unreadable and untouchable and removed, looked at her with everything he had, all of it, every carefully guarded room thrown open at once. "You should know," he said, low and private just for her, "that I have been completely and irreversibly done for since a restroom corridor in a club you deserve to own." She squeezed his hands. "I know. I just wanted to say it properly." "You said it perfectly," she told him. 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning in the apartment they'd made into a home, her architectural sketches on the walls, his reading glasses on the kitchen table, the city outside doing its slow, indifferent turning, she showed him 2 lines on a small white test and watched his face do the thing it only ever did for her. Open, completely, without armor. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he pulled her into his arms, careful, certain, the way he held everything that mattered, and pressed his mouth to her hair, and she felt the exhale move through him, long and quiet, like a man finally, setting something heavy down. The girl they'd told wasn't good enough was building spaces for her city. The man who'd never let anyone close was learning, daily and gladly, and with everything he had, to stay open. And Seoul moved on around them, bright and indifferent and enormous, while in one apartment above the skyline, something small and new and extraordinary was beginning. You made it to the end, and that means you're truly part of the LUE Stories community. Thank you for your support. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be replying as always. And stay subscribed because the next story is already waiting for you.